from COP26 this morning. Those outcomes will bear directly on whether the world can achieve its carbon neutrality targets by mid-century or a little bit beyond, and whether as an international community, we can indeed hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and aiming to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So the global economy by 2050 and 2060, we also know will be much bigger compared to today. There will be more people on this planet, but we envision this future to be carbon neutral, powered predominantly by renewable energy with less energy intensity per capita. And if we think about it, 2050 and 2060 are really not that far away as we head into 2022. And to complicate matters, the world, of course, is still fighting through a pandemic. So that's the lay of the land. That's the challenge we face overall as humanity. So what will be the roadmap to carbon neutrality and the battle against climate change look like from here? We have quite an esteemed panel to share their thoughts on this topic. We will first be hearing video messages from Jose Manuel Barroso, who is the co-chairman of the IFF, board chair of the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. Mr. Barroso was also the former president of the European Commission and former prime minister of Portugal. We'll also be hearing video remarks from Kazuhiko Takeuchi, who is the president of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. And from there, we will open our summit discussion with our online panelists. They are Jose Antonio Ocampo, professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Professor Ocampo was a former Undersecretary General of the UN and Colombia's a former Minister of Finance. Dr. Frank Ries-Berman is Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. Dr. Zhou Yueqiu is Chief Economist at the world's largest bank, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. Sir Danny Alexander is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and Dr. Jai Yongping is Senior Advisor of Strategic Development at Tencent, advising the tech giant on carbon neutrality and renewable energy development. Dr. Jai was also the former director of the Asian Development Bank's Energy Division and is the only panelist who is in person in Guangzhou. So Dr. Jai, thank you for holding down the fort for us in Guangzhou, actually attending the event there at the IFF. That, unfortunately, all of us are online. This is the new normal in the pandemic era, and hopefully we can come together to get over the pandemic era and be in person at the next IFF event. Right, so let's get first video remarks from Mr. Jose Manuel Barroso on this topic. If we could play that video, please.
It's a great pleasure for me to participate also in this specific session of the IFF conference on the issue of carbon neutrality and on the issue of fighting climate change, which is a very, very important and urgent issue. As you know, I come from Europe, so naturally I will bring you a European perspective. But I hope it is not only a European perspective, it is also with a global inspiration, because I think that if there is one issue that by nature is global and that requires a globalized response, is precisely the fight against climate change. Because what is in question, what is under threat, is our planet, our globe. So we need a globalized, multilateral response, if possible, with a true and sincere spirit of cooperation and a very strong multilateralism. In the European Union, we are giving this issue great importance and priority for many years. I'd like to share with you my experience. I had the honor to be presiding to the European Commission for 2 mandates, 10 years, between 2004 and 2014. And it was precisely my commission that put forward a proposal that was known as Europe 2020. The idea was to engage in a series of decisions and actions that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by 20%, comparing the values of 2020 to the values we had in 1990. So a 20% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, we have done it. In fact, the European Union countries from that period until 2020 have reduced these greenhouse gas emissions, not only 20%, but almost 30%. And this was a very important achievement because it was not easy to put together all the member states. At a certain point, we were 28 member states in the European Union. In fact, our package was a package known as 20-20-20 because it was also about incorporating 20% of renewables in our energy mix and to have 20% of gains in terms of energy efficiency. And we have done it. And we have done it through regulation. It was not easy, to be very honest with you, because some countries did not like to be keeping, let's say, binding commitments in terms of legislation on these matters. But I believe that was important to achieve that commitment and that level of ambition, because that regulation created the positive incentives, and if I may say so also, the negative incentives for what governments could do or not do, and not only governments also, but the business in general, the society in the more broader sense. That's why I think we need more of this. We need serious commitments. Now we had recently COP26 with great ambition. My opinion of COP26, and once again, I'm speaking on a personal capacity, I'm not representing here any specific government or any institution or international organization. I'm speaking with complete freedom and intellectual independence. My opinion is that COP26 was certainly a progress, but not sufficient. It's the old story of the glass half full or half empty. We can concentrate on the half full, and half full were some important agreements, announcements, and aspirational goals. That was certainly something that we should be happy with, because that made clear that today there is a much greater commitment on the fight against climate change that we had before. Today, people and societies understand that it is indeed an existential threat, and some countries made very important announcements. That is, as I said, a half full perspective, but there is a half empty perspective, is that in many cases, I would say in most cases, these commitments were not binding from a legal point of view. They do not constitute a part of a legal global treaty. And that in some cases also, the countries have announced goals. I would call them sometimes aspirational goals, certainly in the right direction. We can discuss the level of ambition, but no doubts in the right direction, but they did not indicate us exactly how to achieve that goal. And the credibility of the effort is very important. So this is my assessment of COP26. Yes, a possible step in the right direction. Yes, it created a new momentum for more international convergence in this very important fight against climate change, but it is a process. Next year, the global community will meet in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. There will be afterwards other meetings, and I hope that what has been done until now, and I remember, of course, the very important Convention on Climate in Paris, and now with the added value of Glasgow, that we build on that to achieve concrete deliverables, and that there will be more certainty and a more binding nature of the commitments made, and more clarity about the way how the different countries with very different situations are going to fulfill their goals. I understand it's difficult because some countries, namely developing countries, they feel that for their development, they need still some margin in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, we have seen that progress, including in Europe, was possible even with very tight goals in terms of reduction of emissions. There is a green economy that also can create jobs and can create progress. We have seen examples of this all over the world, new technologies. So I think that to achieve our goals in terms of carbon zero and protecting our planet, we need regulation, we need technology, and we need the markets to function in a way that is compatible with these goals. So it's a holistic approach. It's not just one. It's not just regulation, or it's not just technology. It's not just the markets. We need, by the way, many funds from the public sector, namely to help the countries that are the poorest countries to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. So public funding is necessary, but also private sector contribution is necessary. And we are seeing now much more interest of the private sector on this matter, because also the private sector, at least I speak here from European perspective, is feeling the pressure of public opinion. And we have two great allies in this fight against climate change. It is public opinion, namely young people all over the world that are more and more aware of the challenge, but also science. And science is making it clear that we have to do more if you want to protect the quality of life in our planet. So overall, I remain confident, but I remain realistic. We have to continue, but we have to increase our ambition if you want to keep global, sustainable quality of life in our planet, and if you want to protect our planet from extreme climate change. I thank you for your kind attention.
And we thank Mr. Barroso for his video remarks. Confident but realistic when it comes to tackling climate change, talking about there was certainly progress at COP26 in Glasgow, but not sufficient. That is the view from Jose Manuel Barroso. Okay, let's next play our video message from Mr. Kazuhiko Takeuchi, President of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies.
Distinguished participants, my name is Takeuchi Kazuhiko, President of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGES. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to the IFF 2021 annual meeting and the Carbon Neutrality Summit. Taking this opportunity, please allow me to first share my view on the outcomes of the recent Conference of the Parties, namely UNFCCC COP26 for climate and CBD COP15.1 for biodiversity. Then I would like to reiterate the importance of integrated approaches to climate change and biodiversity loss in the next 10 years, which is a decisive decade for global sustainability. Both climate and biodiversity processes in recent years are negotiating critical milestones in 2030. After 2030, measures should be further accelerated toward realizing the future we want by mid-century. For climate, we hope that greenhouse gas emissions peak by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 to 2070, depending on national circumstances. For biodiversity, we have to achieve no net loss by 2030 and net gain by 2050. Where are we now? First, at COP26, countries agreed on shifting to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target and negotiated the final piece of the rules of the Paris Agreement, Article 6. In the COP26 cover decision, coal was mentioned for the very first time, with unabated coal-fired power to be phased down. Going forward, we may see the discussion turn toward strengthening measures to limit the use of other fossil fuels, including oil and natural gas. Yet it has become clear that current national commitments alone will not allow us to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To fill this commitment gap, countries are expected to re-evaluate their 2030 targets next year. Meanwhile, over 120 countries signed the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration of Forest and Land Use, agreeing to strengthen their shared effort to conserve forests and other terrestrial ecosystems and accelerate their restoration. Together, they represent over 90% of the world's forest. For biodiversity, the CBD COP 15.1 was held in mid-October. The second part, to be held in the spring of next year, is the stage for agreeing on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The world has largely failed to meet the Aichi target, but the new framework should pave the way for the transformation toward a society where humans and nature can live in harmony. In particular, countries are debating the 30 by 30 target, protecting 30% of the planet's land and water by 2030. However, there is a limit to how much we can expand protected area. In this regard, other effective area-based conservation measures, so-called OECMs, are important. One example is the Satoyama Satoumi in Japan, which allow people to sustainably use and manage ecosystem services. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to re-evaluate our relationship with nature. The principle of planetary health, the idea that the health of people is based on the health of the planet, has become more widely accepted. The biodiversity framework should serve to promote such integrated approaches. We are starting to recognize that addressing multiple planetary challenges facing humankind in an integrated manner is critical. 2 weeks before IFF 2021 at IGES annual conference, we discussed the idea that there is really only one fundamental problem, that socioeconomic systems have exceeded our planetary boundaries. However, there are many symptoms of this single problem: climate change, biodiversity loss, and others. We unfortunately saw these symptoms as separate issues 20 years ago. Having this realization and wanting to address the fragmented nature of science, I began promoting sustainability science and founded an academic journal of the same name. Today, there is no longer room for debate that such integrated approaches are critical to addressing planetary challenges. ESG investors can help provide this funding by buying social bonds or sustainability bonds. Finally, I would like to stress once more that we are in the decisive decade, not only for climate, but also for biodiversity, disaster risk reduction, and the achievement of the SDGs. We have only 9 years left. I believe that the IFF 2021 is an important opportunity to renew our commitment and share good practices. It is my hope that the CBD COP 15.2 next year is a place to further accelerate integrated approaches. Thank you for your kind attention.
And our thanks there to Kazuhiko Takeuchi for his video remarks, again talking about such a decisive decade, the 2020s, in terms of our fight against climate change. We are certainly heading up to 2030 when our commitments really need to strengthen if we want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 for most of the world, and then 2060 for China, before 2060 for China. Okay, let's open it up to our online discussion. And I just want to take stock first of everyone's assessment of COP26. We just heard about the assessment from Mr. Kazuhiko as well as Jose Manuel Barroso, but for our online panelists, Professor Ocampo, if I could begin with you and to get your thoughts on what happened in Glasgow. It's not easy, right? It's not easy to get nearly 200 countries in consensus on tackling this common humanity challenge of ours. So what do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be in this IFF. I'm honored to participate in this discussion today. And let me start by saying that Glasgow was, of course, a partial success. It restated the objectives that were set in Paris 6 years ago, and it showed commitments by the many countries that signed the agreement. However, let me emphasize the word partial, because in fact, we have to see the real commitments of countries to contribute to reaching the goals of trying to avoid warming on top of 1.5 degrees centigrades, and certainly to guarantee that it's less than 2 degrees centigrades, which was the Paris Agreement. The commitments made after Paris, as the UN made clear, would have led to would lead to a warming of 2.7 degrees. So the commitments have to be significantly increased by all countries and all sectors of the economy in order to guarantee reaching the Paris Glasgow objectives. So let me say in that regard that there were, of course, good signs, as some of the previous speakers made clear. For example, the agreement on forests was a good one by more than 100 countries. Also, the agreement on methane emissions, so that implicitly putting that, which is actually one of the worst factors of global warming in place. Let me say the agreement between the US and China was also a positive news, although it did not include any specific ideas and commitments as such. But on the other hand, we saw, for example, no commitments, strong commitments in any of the transport sectors. The lack of agreement in the meeting on the stopping altogether the production of cars and vehicles that use fossil fuels. That was not possible. There was a very partial commitment by some countries, but not by some of the major producers of cars. And there was in the meetings that took place before, there was also no agreement on the air transportation and maritime transportation. All of those are crucial sectors, as well as as the processing of basic metals, which of course will hopefully experience a revolution with the hydrogen energy technologies. But that is still a promise rather than a true reality. So if I may say, the next 12 months leading to the next COP are absolutely essential, and the commitments have to be significantly increased by all parties. Otherwise, we are not going to have not reach the objectives, and what is even worse, we'll have significantly inequity issues not being addressed. The inequities with the future generations, first of all, but inequities among countries, the tropics, which are going to be strongly affected, the islands that are going to disappear because of that, and the social inequities, because it is quite clear, according to all the estimates, that 50% of the emissions are the result of the consumption of 10% of reaches 10% of the population. So so let me say that I think that the real commitments will come in the next 12 months. So I really hope to see a strong commitment by countries to start with, but also equally by the sectors of production or the economy that are strongly sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor Ocampo. So hoping for some real commitments in the next 12 months in terms of climate action. Danny, I want to come to you, your overall assessment of COP26. I mean, to me, it felt like there was a greater focus in Glasgow on the 1.5 degrees target. There was also more of a focus, I would say, on 2030 compared to 2050. And Article 6 of the Paris Agreement was approved, which sets up, of course, this voluntary carbon credit trading mechanism. So in terms of these elements that were talked about in Glasgow, I mean, how significant do you think they are, especially when it comes to finally agreeing on Article 6 and getting perhaps a global carbon trading market in place?
Well, thank you very much. And I'm actually speaking to you from my quarantine hotel in Shanghai, where I've returned to China, having attended COP26 in Glasgow to lead the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's delegation. So it's good to have the chance to report back and to engage in this discussion. My own view is that given the circumstances, the Glasgow Climate Pact was actually at the upper end of what could reasonably be expected for an agreement to be reached at this stage. But it's also true, and rightly been emphasized by other speakers, that there is a great deal more to be done, both in terms of achieving further commitments at the country and at the international level, and of course, most importantly, in terms of implementing the agreements and the commitments that have been made. I think that one of the interesting features is that having gone after Paris from a position where countries update their nationally determined contributions, that's the policies that they intend to implement domestically to support the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's now been agreed that will be updated every year. And so as emphasized by Professor Ocampo, next year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, all the parties will be expected to come back with further commitments, because you rightly emphasize that the goal of Glasgow was to keep the objective of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade, to keep that 1.5 commitment alive. And I think the presidency concluded at the end of it that it was alive, but a lot more needed to be done to actually to get it within reach. And of course, it's not that far away, unfortunately. You know, we've seen the information saying that already global temperatures have risen by 1.1 degrees. And we see the consequences every day and in every corner of the planet. You know, here in China, we saw in the summer the terrible flooding in Henan province and elsewhere. AIB is committed to support the reconstruction, and that's considered also to be climate change adaptation because of the way that it's being done. But I'd also say that in Glasgow, in addition to the new commitments made by countries, you also saw some new issues being brought onto the table. Methane, with a commitment on methane by many countries, not all, but I think and more I hope will sign up. A lot of the controversy at the end of the meeting was about language on coal, but it was the first time that language on coal was included in such a declaration, and so already commitment to phasing down coal is progress compared to where we were before. And as was emphasized by one of the speakers earlier, nature and biodiversity. There's a crucial interlinkage between climate and nature and biodiversity. That was also put onto the agenda. But in a way, I think that to me, one of the most important developments at Glasgow was the strong commitments from the private sector. Now, these are commitments, again, they have to be translated into real investments. But nonetheless, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero brought together financial firms with assets of $130 trillion. And if through the work of governments and multilateral organizations like the AIB and the GGGI, then that money can be unlocked for investment in real projects, then it will be very important. From the AIB's point of view, we've committed that at least 50% of our financing will be for climate finance by 2025. That means we'll commit at least $50 billion for climate finance over the course of this decade. And like in common with other multilateral development banks with whom we've worked closely together, we'll all be implementing so-called Paris alignment, which means that every single project we do, whether or not climate is the objective, will have to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement from the middle of 2023. And so I think there's a significant role for multilateral institutions to support countries and to achieve their NDCs, to help develop policies that can go further, and to put in place measures to help unlock the considerable scale of private sector capital that is available and much needed, given the multi-trillion-dollar scale of the financing task over the coming years. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Danny. Dr. Jia Yongping, I want to come to you next and maybe give us China's perspective on COP26 and your own perspective on this. And you were formerly with the ADB, you are now with Tencent, and Danny was just talking about the private sector. Perhaps you could give us some more flavor in terms of the private sector's embrace of carbon neutrality, because we hear pretty much all companies these days having that carbon neutrality commitment.
好，谢谢主持人呐。这个我是唯一。Oh, thank you very much. I'm the only panelist on site offline, so I will speak in Chinese because most of the audience members on site are Chinese. In order to address your question, talking about COP26, well, I'm not representing China. I'm just speaking in my personal capacity, working for a non-SOE company in China. How do I evaluate the outcomes of Glasgow? Well, first, to take a look at any event or conference to say whether it's successful or not, there's got to be a yardstick. And I think there's a quantitative yardstick, which is the focus on the control of a temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This target is still viable and with a commitment of most parties. So, but how far away are we from this objective? Are we closer or further away? Many institutions have provided their respective answers based on the current set of commitments by countries. We are edging closer to attaining this objective, but some are saying it will be 1.9 degrees or even 2.4 degrees. But regardless of the numbers, we need to translate the commitments into concrete efforts in order to make this target more likely within reach. So implementation is the key. We've got to do the following. First, it takes to have a roadmap. And for this roadmap, the most critical part is not about timing carbon neutrality by 2050, 2060 versus 2070. But starting from 2021 to 2025 to 2030, what will we be doing? That's of crucial importance. And in order to achieve milestones along this roadmap, where do we get the funds? What is the source of funding? For the funding sources, carbon pricing is going to play a critical role. I will not repeat yesterday's discussions about carbon pricing. And in this roadmap, there should be concrete technical options and the solutions from low carbon emission to zero carbon emission, all the way to negative carbon emission. Also, I would like to add that as energy expert working for ADB, I had been working in developing countries for many years from the perspective of developing economies. Glasgow delivers a great deal of hope, not without challenges. Developing countries are faced with triple challenges. First, they need to satisfy their demand for energy. In some countries, some segments of population are yet to be covered by electricity. Second, while satisfying their own energy needs, we've got to supply low carbon energy. And for the third challenge, for some island economies, they are hardest hit by the consequences of climate change. That's why I'm saying developing economies are confronted with triple challenges, and the international community must pay attention to their needs and challenges. Well, as tech company or non-SOE company, what is Tencent doing? What is my company doing? Well, it takes a roadmap, capital funding, and technologies. So for those three aspects, our company is working very hard on all three. First, as a company, we are working on our own carbon neutrality roadmap. We have a lot of data centers. How do we ensure our data centers are running with carbon neutrality? It involves investment and technologies, such as low carbon, zero carbon, or even negative carbon technologies. We have committed funding and investments to support our journey of carbon neutrality by ourselves. But as a company, as a very big tech company, when we talk about carbon neutrality, we look forward to leveraging digitalization, digital technologies, our technologies to assist in other industries and sectors such as energy, iron, steel, cement, and various other institutions. We are looking forward to work with them in order to develop more use cases for digital technologies. In the process to attain carbon neutrality, digital technologies will play a very big part to make low carbon, zero carbon, or even negative carbon possible. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Zhao. I think it's very important in terms of what digital tech, how that can transform traditional energy industries, as well as traditional industries overall, like iron, steel, and cement that you mentioned. You were also talking about where do we get the funds to tackle climate change, right? Because the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that we need anywhere between 1.6 to 3.8 trillion US dollars to avoid warming exceeding 1.5 degrees centigrade. So on that, let me get to Dr. Zhou Chu, Chief Economist at ICBC, to talk to us about maybe the state of green finance. So as the world's largest bank, ICBC certainly has its role to play in terms of financing green projects. Maybe talk to us about that and then your overall outlook, your assessment of COP26. Dr. Zhou.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. It's my great pleasure to participate in the annual conference of IFF to talk about climate change, carbon neutrality, green finance, what role can be played by green finance. That's a very important topic. You know, according to previous panelists, I've listened attentively to all of you. Your remarks have shed a lot of light on me. Yes, I do have my own observations regarding your question. But I'm not representing ICBC. I'm just speaking in my personal capacity. Well, let's take a look at the outcomes of Glasgow. What impact will it generate on climate change? According to the others, we have heard that at Glasgow, there's been a partial success. I very much agree with this assessment. Because at Glasgow, there has been no specific or general agreement as a result. There's no all-encompassing agreement, but there are partial agreements, partial consensus. The majority of countries at this conference agreed on the determination and resolve to avert further climate change and to achieve carbon neutrality in the future. Yes, there's still a gap with regard to the Paris Agreement objectives.
But I guess the outcome of the COP26 can be reflected in the following 4 changes, which will bring about fundamental changes to our production and life. The first change can be said of setting up new objectives and goals. We have the so-called classical climate compact, the goal of which is to control the temperature rise within 1.5 degrees, as previously mentioned by my co-panelists, that nearly 85% of the members have already updated their new NDCs. So this should be positively acknowledged. One important element which has been mentioned by the co-panelists is that we should gradually reduce the subsidies. And also for the energy transformation, China and US has also signed a common declaration between China and the United States, and it should be binding. That is to say that concrete measures would have to be taken in using the clean energy. And the third element is about the emerging markets. If you have a retrospect of the Paris Agreement, Article 6 is that the carbon market in the financial market globally has been defined, and we have moved a step further in this regard, which would enable and facilitate the trading of the carbon trading market and mechanism. So this is the third change. And the fourth one is actually centered around international collaboration and partnerships. Let me just come back to the Glasgow joint declaration between China and US. In terms of the cooperation, there is a very important mechanism. It is declared that we aim to set up such a task force of enhancing the work in the climate change. It means that it is not only some measure in principle, but a kind of a specific measure which will be implemented by a specific task force. I think this really resonates with all my co-panelists in saying that we would have to translate what we have promised as commitments into concrete actions. And the next point is that the climate funding shall play a pivotal role so as that the international financial institutions and the markets can have a bigger role to play in combating the climate change. As you have asked the question in the green finance, I believe this is also a very important arrangement in this regard. So this is my opinion. And the second part of my observation is that how are we going to react to the climate change, and the reaction which is highly challenging, and it is a long-term issue. I believe that is why we need to stand together to face up to the challenge and risks. As someone who works in the financial institution reacting to the climate change, undoubtedly it is a responsibility. Well, at the same time, I would also like to define it as an opportunity. The 4 new changes, as I illustrated, represents the changing trends. But for financial institutions, we have seen the coexistence of responsibility and opportunities. When it comes to responsibilities, we'll have to set up the new targets in the green finance. That is to say, we would have to shoulder our own responsibilities as a responsible corporate citizen, because clearly finance is a key in promoting the transformation of our measures in reaction to the climate change, which can be fully represented in China's dual carbon target. Green finance has been clarified as a very important column and guarantee mechanisms. So during the processes of the combating of the climate change, we would have to provide finance to support the upgradation of the traditional industries and provide more funding to the green and low carbon sectors. So this is our responsibility. Not only it is a responsibility socially and environmentally, however, during the energy transformation process, we would also need to empower the transitions of all the sectors. The Chinese financial watchdogs for the green energy, we have already upgraded many catalogs in the supporting of the green energy sectors. They are trying to give a guidance to the financial institutions of the right direction that we need to move. They have also set up some incentive policies to guide the financial institutions to better allocate their green financing to the sectors that the regulators aim to direct them to. So I believe such arrangements are concrete measures China has taken. For example, China has committed that we are not going to provide any funding for the overseas fossil fuel power generation plant. And for the domestic power plant, we are going to gradually phase out and transform to a more green and low carbon model. So during this process, the financial institutions are tasked to provide help to reduce carbon-2 emissions and also improve energy efficiency and leveraging cutting-edge technologies. So this is the responsibility part that I have illustrated because as a corporate citizen, we would have to shoulder our CSR. While at the same time, we should also need to explore the opportunities during the processes of this transformation is equally important. As we have mentioned, among the 4 changes, we have seen the new markets. To financial institutions, it is definitely a new market because for the carbon market, it aims to resolve the externalities of the carbon emissions so as to effectively reduce the carbon emissions so as to reach a target of net zero or even a negative emission, no matter trying to reduce the cost of the carbon. We would like to give a full play to the role of the prices of the carbon. We have seen great opportunities for the financial institutions to play. For COP26, for the Article 6, if a consensus can be formed, a uniform carbon trading market can be shaped globally. It means that the carbon financial services would be further enhanced and deepened. And for the Chinese carbon market, we have kickoff in this July centered around the transactions, settlements, clearing. These things will present great opportunities for the financial institutions. The financial infrastructure will be optimized during this process. For example, the financial derivatives and the spot market are centered around carbon, and we will also see more diversified carbon products. The role of the financial institutions will be more prominent during this process. That is why I define it as an opportunity. Well, when it comes to building up new partnerships, the international collaboration among the financial institutions are also seeing new opportunities, how to react to the climate change risks, and how can we, during the process of collaboration, how can we come out with a risk warning system and risk management system. For example, in the energy transformation process, we have found out the opportunities of collaboration among different regions and different countries. And also, when it comes to the innovative projects, some climate responsible investment and financing tools can be developed. Reacting to the climate change, the financial institutions would have to shoulder its responsibilities. But if you can take and leverage these opportunities to find business opportunities, it is not only a win-win, it is a multi-win. So this is my second perspective. Thirdly, financial institutions in reacting to climate change can have a much bigger role to play. Developing green finance is of significance. China hasn't really had a very rich experience in developing green finance. However, in order to reach our dual carbon role, green finance is something that we would have to incorporate into which for it to be attainable. Because as mentioned by previous speakers, finance plays a key role in this process. For example, to optimize the institutional framework and in defining the strategies and missions, as well as setting up specific procedures and processes. It is all very important. And the second one is about the capital structure, because it would definitely bring about the changes in the structure of the capital. First of all, for the new energy and for the strategic industry, we would have to have more input and investment into it. And the second category is the transformation of the conventional industry. How can we give them a green upgrade, and how can we empower them to save energy and to reduce the CO2 emissions is also part of the responsibilities of the FIs, financial institutions. So for the low carbon transformation would have to be compatible with a cost which can be provided by the FIs. So various types of funds can be channeled into the projects to make it compatible with the cost inherent in it. We also need to control the risks as well, because transformation means pressure and risks. So the risk management mechanism should be further enhanced to avoid the risks of the transformation. So all in all, I believe that the COP26 has its own achievements as an outcome, which has produced both opportunities and responsibilities for the FIs, and FIs can have a bigger role in it. So this is basically from me.
Great. Thank you for that very comprehensive overview, Dr. Zhou. Dr. Rees-Bramman, I want to come to you because as of right now, still around 80% of the world's energy demand is met by fossil fuels. And we want to reach that carbon neutrality target by 2050, 2060, or 2070. So there's a big challenge ahead. Maybe give us your take in terms of what's next for reaching our net zero targets. And then how is GGGI, how are you thinking about perhaps designing a green project that can really balance the risk and reward needs of investors?
Thank you, Mr. Wang. It's my honor to address the Net Zero Summit, the Carbon Neutrality Summit of IFF. And first, let me remind you that, as an observer for the last about 40 years as a climate scientist and an observer and participant in the climate policy and diplomacy world, For most of those years, very little was happening. Now this race to net zero has actually gained a very widespread acceptance in a remarkably short time. There's more than 90% of the world population and 90% of GDP covered by net zero pledges. And while this target is not fully achieved in Glasgow, many observers have concluded that the 1.5 goal is alive, be it on life support. It's also important to remember that the 1.5 goal coming from the IPCC report is indeed directly leading to this net zero by 2050 requirement. And the other goal that the IPCC set was that to be credible to have net zero by 2050, we should have 45 to 50% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030. Of course, we're not quite there yet, but we have seen significant progress. And in the many interviews I've now had with journalists following COP26, the key questions that are being asked, I think, by the public at large is, are these pledges really realistic and are they credible? And that comes back to the question that you just asked, what can we do to increase the realism and credibility of these net zero pledges? Personally, I believe that it is realistic, and not only realistic, but even necessary, given that we are indeed not just living in a world that would be a little bit worse off if we didn't get there, but we are indeed facing an existential crisis, or as Mr. Takeuchi already said, we are risking planetary boundaries to be exceeded. So we do have to find a way. And there are in fact many opportunities. We can still accelerate the adoption of some already well-developed technologies. Renewable energy can indeed be much faster adopted, both through better policies, but also through the green finance examples that are given here. Renewable energy has become the cheapest form of energy now. E-mobility is not quite the cheapest form of transport, but quite a few countries are beginning to set policies that can accelerate the race to have transport completely electrified. I would also like to name buildings as a sector where there are mature technologies. There is an easy win in a way to make buildings much less energy intensive and build more green buildings throughout the world and deal better with our waste, and indeed accelerate nature-based solutions to climate change. So overall, I am quite optimistic that there are realistic options that we can accelerate using the kind of green finance that has been brought to the table now. And yes, we'll also need innovation. Particularly green hydrogen is an important opportunity for those hard to decarbonize parts of the economy. And it is not yet electrolytic hydrogen produced with renewable energy is not yet commercially attractive. But I believe that if we indeed invest sufficiently in the research and development, by 2030, it could be commercially attractive. And let me remind the audience also that we're not just doing this for climate change. If we are able to achieve net zero, there will be many other co-benefits. Blue skies, air pollution can be combated hand in hand with climate change. Of course, incredibly important for many in Asia, as air pollution is still the largest killer, the largest environmental killer of more than 4 million people in Asia. And the other co-benefit is that I see many opportunities to increase green jobs. Green employment is very positively correlated with the solutions in the green transition. Of course, not all the same people that gain green jobs will be those that lose their brown jobs. So yes, we do have a challenge for transition, but overall, there will be a significant increase in green jobs as a result of this green transition. So are these pledges credible? I think the pledges do not all yet have the kind of roadmaps and policies that they require. The first step is indeed to see pledges for net zero translated in NDC commitments for 2030. And as we have concluded, not all countries have done so. Quite a few important emitters, particularly in Europe, have done so, but we need others to come forward next year in Sharm el-Sheikh. I do agree with other observers that the private sector coming forward, the very rapid increase in EGS, in net zero commitments from the private sector is very promising. Certainly also the Glasgow Alliance bringing financiers to the climate table is important. Although on the other hand, observers also worry that these corporate pledges may involve greenwashing. And yes, there are some oil companies that make net zero pledges where it is difficult to imagine that those can be serious if at the same time they try to expand the exploration of fossil fuels. So I think we will have to be very careful that our efforts to reach carbon neutrality in the private sector are indeed met with good standards for environmental integrity, and that multilateral organizations and governments have a key role to play. There will be some important challenges. Coal in Asia is potentially the #1 issue in the coming years. While other parts of the world have already reduced the use of coal, the most serious emitter of greenhouse gases, in Asia overall, the trend is still not yet positive. The most positive action, I think, is that China, Japan, and Korea, who have to date been funding the large majority of coal-fired power plants, have all three committed to end funding coal-fired power plants. So yes, I think it is a key role for organizations like my own and AIIB and others to help developing countries come up with green investment projects in infrastructure, in renewable energy, that allow the funding that used to flow to financing coal-fired power plants now to flow to these carbon neutrality projects. And yes, the green finance, the green finance from banks, the green bonds that have also been mentioned are indeed a very large opportunity. The green bond market has more or less exploded in recent years, although almost entirely in developed economies. But in these years, we see an increased opportunity in emerging economies. GRGI has worked with the governments of Peru, Mexico, and Vietnam, for example, to issue this year their first green bonds worth the first $4 billion. And we see that as a rapidly increasing opportunity, certainly for emerging economies and gradually also for lesser developed economies as well. And finally, Article 6, we work with about 20 countries to prepare for such a global carbon market. In many developing countries, stronger governments and stronger MRVs, monitoring, reporting, and verification systems need to put in place in order for those trades to become realistic. But I expect there as well that there will be rapid development, and there's certainly a lot of interest both on the buyer and the supplier side. So overall, Mr. Wang, I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be a rapidly increasing wave of green investment projects, and that there will be green finance to support this race to net zero. It won't be easy, but as I said, it's necessary to get there. Thank you very much.
Dr. Rees-Behrman, if I may follow up, as a climate scientist, I want to get your take in terms of, do you think the pace of the increase in renewable energy, is that going to be fast enough to meet our carbon neutrality goals? Because like I mentioned earlier, right now, still the world's energy demands, about 80% comes from fossil fuels. Can renewable energy in the global energy mix, can that increase at a fast enough pace?
From a technology perspective, it can. We still see too many governments that are not yet convinced that renewable energy is indeed cheaper. But wherever we can put the right policies in place, where governments are available, willing to make land available or put decent power purchase agreements in place, we actually see an abundance of private sector capital willing to invest. So yes, I do not see the current pace as adequate, but I see opportunities to increase the pace for renewable energy adoption in many emerging and developing countries. And that will be necessary. And actually, it will give those countries an opportunity to expand energy access. In countries in Africa, for instance, it's not really about reducing emissions. It's about increasing energy access. So those two goals can be addressed together, hand in hand.
Yeah. Professor Ocampo, I want to come back to you because from all of our panelists, we have the sense of urgency in terms of addressing climate change, Mr. Takeuchi was talking about really the 2020s being such a decisive decade. But unfortunately, things are being complicated by the pandemic in terms of short-term and medium-term spending and investments on climate change. That might be a little bit more cloudy as we spend to tackle the pandemic. What do you think? How do we sort of maybe think about climate change as we are still in the pandemic era? In the 2020s, we need to lay that solid foundation for 2050, for 2060, and 2070.
Well, let me say that in looking from the point of view of the pandemic, actually the commitments can be an opportunity for developing countries and for the world as a whole. For an obvious reason, I mean, this requires new investment, and investment generates, new economic activities. Of course, at the same time, there are sectors of production that will have to decline. It's also an opportunity for technical change, and therefore for research and development, because many, to meet some of the criteria, some of the objectives, would require new technologies. So the efforts to invest in research and development are also important, and this is a great opportunity for the countries that are leading in this area, including China. I must emphasize. Now, as many of the panelists have pointed out, one of the major issues is financing, and I first of all, there was no agreement actually on increase. Well, first of all, we failed to, or developed countries failed to meet the target of $100 billion in contribution for developing countries that they committed more than a decade ago, and to reach that target by 2020. That was not reached, and there was no agreement to increase that in a clear way going forward. So that's one of the issues that we have to agree, or developed countries have to agree on a very strong commitment in that regard. I appreciate the statement by the president of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank on the commitments of that bank, but the multilateral development banks and the development banks in general have a very strong role to play in reaching also the agreements. So we have to see in the next 12 months what are the specific commitments of the multilateral development banks also in this regard. And let me perhaps emphasize very importantly the issue of adaptation. Financing adaptation is absolutely critical. I come from a country in the tropics, and the tropics are going to be strongly affected by climate change. So how to adapt is very important. But we have seen all sorts of problems worldwide, flooding of different forms in many countries, including China. So how to manage adaptation is also a commitment almost of every country. But let me say, in particular, the countries and the regions that are going to be more strongly affected. So what we do in terms of adaptation. This is an area which was generally underestimated in terms of financing in the past, even in terms of commitments. But now it is quite clear that it has to be a major priority going forward.
So Professor Ocampo, I guess most of the funding right now goes to mitigation instead of adaptation, perhaps maybe because it's easier to measure the outcomes and the returns from mitigation. I mean, how do we incentivize countries, perhaps more advanced economies, to invest more in adaptation or to donate more to adaptation for lower income countries and countries on the front lines of climate change?
Well, let me say that adaptation can be measured in terms of how we manage let's say the different natural disasters that are taking place. because of the climate change. I mean, the cost of not doing adaptation are extremely high, as we have seen, let's say, I mean, certainly this year. So in that regard, yes, you can measure very clearly the results of adaptation, not only of mitigation. And I must say that at least in that regard, the Glasgow meeting was good, because for the first time I saw adaptation as a very strong priority, which was not before.
Yeah. Professor Ocampo, I want to ask you one more follow-up, and then I'm going to get to Dr. Jai in terms of his perspectives on China's efforts on carbon neutrality. And that is, you're based in the United States right now, and it seems like the US attitudes towards climate change, Professor Ocampo, is pretty much split on party lines. You have a large number of Americans in the Republican Party who are climate deniers. They are skeptical about climate change. And the Biden administration right now is, of course, they are climate believers. They want to tackle climate change. But every 4 to maybe 8 years, perhaps, the US may backtrack on its climate commitments and cater to the fossil fuel lobbying industry. Are you concerned about that? I mean, the world's largest economy potentially backtracking every 4 to 8 years on its climate stance?
Well, let me start by saying that yes, I live and teach in the United States, but I'm a Colombian. I'm from Colombia,
right?
So, from my country, which is in the tropics. So I mean, to be clear,
right.
And you're right. I mean, this is the U.S. is a country in which there are many denials, even denials of science, which
yes.
is the worst form of denial. So I think that there has to be action. Of course, the Biden administration make commitments and start doing action that hopefully will be irreversible. And for the first time, actually, it's very interesting that the fossil fuel firms from Europe, for example, for several years have been making commitments. But the U.S. firms, the oil firms of the United States, for the first time are starting to talk about this issue. So I think there has been advance. There has been advance, but you are totally correct that the denial and the possibility that the Republicans will take over and deny or stop action in this area is a major problem for this country and for the world.
Okay, yeah, that always sense of uncertainty from the United States, perhaps on its climate stance, I think is something that we need to look out for in the future. Dr. Jai, I want to come to you in terms of China's efforts in achieving carbon neutrality. This will be the world's largest reduction in carbon emissions intensity. I mean, China will go from peak to neutrality in the fastest time possible in history. And it aims to gradually increase the share of non-fossil fuel energy consumption to around 20% by 2025, 25% by 2030, and then over 80% by 2060. So quite ambitious indeed. Which non-fossil fuel energies do you think will drive that transition?
Well, let me put it in perspective. As largest energy consuming nation and one of the largest emitters, we have committed to peaking in 2030 and neutrality in 2060 within a matter of short 30 years, which is a tremendous challenge in 3 aspects. Those 3 aspects are particularly relevant to China, although it also holds true for other countries. In achieving carbon neutrality, we must ensure energy security or energy transition with energy security. For example, we are shifting from 80% fossil energy mix to a net zero emission from now to 2030, from 2030 to carbon neutrality. How can we ensure that there's always security of energy supply without frequent blackouts? Some months ago, there were blackouts in China and elsewhere in the world as well. So in the process of energy transformation, we must ensure that from fossil energy to renewable energy to other zero carbon energies, energy security of energy supply is always ensured. For the second challenge in this transformation process, it should feature equality and fairness for so many employees in the fossil energy sectors and their families. How can we ensure that those employees will be re-employed in new sectors? How can we ensure that they will stand to benefit from the transformation? So we need to ensure equitable and just transformation. We need to shift the energy system from high carbon intensity to low carbon intensity. At the same time, we should make sure that those employees in those sectors will be re-employed in green sectors. That's the second challenge. For the third challenge associated with previous two, and also a very important one, from high carbon to low carbon to zero carbon, can we ensure that the energy access is still affordable? We don't have much research, and we need to prove that from high carbon to low carbon to zero carbon, that the consumers will stand to benefit. Energy will continue to be affordable, while the overall quality of life will be better. Therefore, we need to go through an affordable transformation. Those are the triple challenges confronting China, and China have chances to lead along all three lines. Which renewable energy will play the biggest part? Solar PV, wind, geothermal, hydro, and nuclear are equally important. We cannot miss any one of them. We need to make use all five of them to ensure a secure, safe, just, and equitable transition. From 2030 to 2060, within a matter of 3 decades, can we achieve carbon neutrality or not? Well, when other countries make similar commitments, they have already peaked, right? And then it will take them 60 years to go neutral. So in order to answer this question, for China to evolve from a low-income economy, marching towards middle to high-income economy, from $200 per capita to $11,000 per capita, we have gone through leapfrog developments. As has been proven by the leapfrog developments achieved by the Chinese economy to the marvels of the rest of the world, I'm confident that China will be able to achieve carbon neutrality commitment within a matter of 3 decades, from 2030 to 2060. Thank you.
Dr. Zhai, I want to follow up in terms of what you think China's investments in clean energy may mean for the rest of the world, how that might spill over for the rest of the world. Because when China does things, it does things on scale. And we've already seen what China has done in terms of lowering the costs of solar panels. And if it continues to invest in clean technology, what kind of positive externalities do you think that will bring for the global green transition?
非常好的问题啊，我们可以看待这个问题以光伏的这个。
Very good question. Let's take the example of solar photovoltaic. Around 2000 and since 2000, it was Europe and Germany that played a decisive role in pushing forward solar energy. They went up with strong incentive measures. In Germany, it pushed up demand for solar PV supplies. And then complete value chains were put in place in China with skilled labor, especially non-SOE companies in China, seized this chance to become major suppliers to the solar energy industry.
降低了90%，这就是取决于这个。实际上，我说不仅是中国的努力，是全世界的努力。我刚才提到欧洲，实际上这个过程中，各个这个国家都做出了相应的贡献，但中国有它特别的优势。它的优势您也提到，第一，我们有超大的市场。
As you rightly mentioned, that we have a whole supply chain, and it should be attributable to all the countries across the world, including China. We also have the sufficient capital. All these coming together had really made the cost reduction of 90% for the last 10 years possible in the PV industry. If we look at the wind energy and other renewable energy sectors, especially when people are paying great attention in the negative CO2 emission, for example, CCS and CCUS technology, it is of high cost. However, such a high cost technology in China, when we are trying to attain the carbon neutrality, CCUS is a technology that we will have to use. If we can reduce the cost of CCUS, just as we have reduced the technology in the PV, would be of great significance. We still want to leverage the huge market of China, cheap labor market, and quite advanced R&D. If we would be able to reduce the CCUS and other low carbon technologies cost to a large margin, it would be a huge contribution to the world. I would like to reiterate that the international collaboration is of great significance because the PV industry has been a proven record of international collaboration. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Gai. Indeed, if we can see significant cost reductions for carbon capture, that will be a game changer for our fight against climate change. Danny, I want to come to you because you mentioned that AIIB has a target of 50% of overall approved financing by 2025 directed towards climate finance. If you could shed some more light in terms of how that portfolio mix will be, which sectors you're actually looking at the AIIB.
Thank you very much, and happily to say more about how AIB will implement that commitment 2025 and beyond. When AIB is a multilateral development bank, our focus is on investing in projects, particularly in low and middle income countries in Asia. We do invest in China, but most of our investment is in other parts of the world: India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, and many other countries besides. And to pick up Professor Ocampo's point, which I think is a very important one for Asia too, we need to focus both on climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. There are hundreds of millions of people in Asia living in places that are highly vulnerable to the consequences of climate change, including many millions of people in China. And so one of the things that the commitment to Paris alignment will mean is that an assessment of vulnerability, resilience, adaptation needs is built into every single project. And so I think that's a point that should be taken on board by all investors, is that assessing climate risks, understanding climate vulnerabilities, and making sure that appropriate adaptation measures are put in place, not only for the challenges we see today, but the potential challenges that we may see in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. Secondly, and I would add to that there is an increasing understanding of the role that nature-based solutions can play in supporting many infrastructure needs, but particularly climate change resilience and adaptation. And with COP15 on biodiversity coming up for I think the physical meeting in Kunming in May next year, I think rightly we should use that as an opportunity to focus attention more on how the goals of climate and biodiversity can be met together. But obviously climate change mitigation, as you implied earlier, is critically important. AIB already has a substantial portfolio in renewable energy and in energy transition. So technologies like established technologies like solar, wind, hydroelectric, important in many places, but also looking at how we can support emerging and innovative technologies will all be part of our portfolio. But so is the demand side, and so we have projects in funds looking at data centers and low carbon data centers, a point made earlier on by Professor Jai. We have funds looking at energy and indeed adaptation innovation. But I think too, another aspect is urban infrastructure. Urban infrastructure will be absolutely critical to how climate change goals are met, and making sure that the low carbon agenda is built into future urban infrastructure, investing more in public transport systems. We have a substantial portfolio now of urban light railways, subways, bus transport systems, electric vehicles, electric buses. These kind of things I think are going to be critically important. The last point I'd make is that creating projects in a way that we can mobilize the private sector at scale is critically important. One area where AIB has been actively involved is in terms of trying to support the development of stronger capital markets for green finance in Asia. Asia is behind Europe and North America in this space, and so through things like our Asia Climate Bond portfolio with Amundi, we've been seeking to develop a system to give investors information about sorry, I'm in the quarantine hotel, so people keep phoning for information.
Understandable.
But that bond portfolio is about saying how can we give investors better quality information about issuers and their own movement towards Paris alignment, and I think that's a critical part of this agenda too. Lastly, I'd say, alongside climate, another major priority for AIB is technology investment, and I think increasingly we're going to see. I think increasingly it's an old-fashioned technology.
There we go.
I think increasingly we're going to be seeing new technology and climate having to work together and be increasingly integrated to deliver the kind of progress we need. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for that, Danny. Dr. Zhou, I want to come to you, and if you could briefly talk to us about the development of China's green finance industry, because again, China right now is the world's largest investor in terms of green technologies and green energy, but in terms of what else green finance can do, maybe talk about China's experience.
Wonderful. Yes, indeed. Concerning about green finance, at least for the past years, China had witnessed the accelerated pace of momentum of the green finance. So it has played a pivotal role in the transformation to the low carbon green economy. Let me give you two examples. From the banking perspective, the balance of the loan exceeds 14 trillion for the green finance. Other people are talking about the green bonds. The balance of the green bonds reaches 1.12 trillion. So it is a huge amount. We should say that we are ranking among the top of all the countries across the globe. If we look at these two figures and looking back into China's green finance, as I said, that we are not the first movers in green finance. Why? We have being able to develop at a more rapid speed. I believe there are some commonalities for the green finance empowering the transformation of the low carbon green economy, as I have mentioned, in the governance structure level, in the board of directors or the senior management, there should be a committee set up and a strategy should be set up as a mission. So such a direction of your corporate strategy is of high importance. ICBC as a bank has done exactly what I have mentioned. That is to say, it should be driven top down by the board of directors, senior management, then to the business line, to the overseas branches. It is a holistic system. Compared with the traditional finance, it is still different. We would have to form up a viable, profitable model to make green finance possible. So innovation is of significance during this process, no matter the green finance products or the investment pool that the green finance has put its input into, or the pilot areas, pilot projects of the green finance are very good explorations. And thirdly, for the risk management and open collaboration, I wouldn't really further elaborate because we need to maintain order, security. How can we control the risks? And for the granting of the credit facility and the risk measurement, risk appetite are all the challenges financial institutions are facing. The FIs are making some research. For example, starting from 2015, ICBC began to conduct research and assessment on the stress test because of the environmental impact of the companies that has been taking corporate loans from ICBC. So by having such a practice in the risk management, in the cost measurement, banks would be more mature. Collaboration domestically or internationally is of great significance. It is not only that we are going to find a collaborative opportunity or a specific products. More importantly, on such a collaborative platform, we can share best practices and experiences which can empower the low carbon and green transformation in financing. Cases can be selected in this way. I think the reason that China can have a very fast move in green finance is because we have been part of the international community of learning the cases. We have published some literatures of the exemplary cases in the green finance, not only China, but other countries. During the exchanges, we have found out that we have so many things that we can learn from each other. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for that, Dr. Zhou. We are out of time, but I want to give the last word to Dr. Jai, if you could wrap things up for us. And I want to ask you in terms of how we can better scale green technologies in developing countries. I think digital technology has a key role to play in this. The private sector has a key role to play in this. How do we do that?
谢谢主持人这个问题啊。
Thank you. Wonderful question. I have been working in Asia and Africa for more than 30 years. I have mentioned in my previous speeches in all these developing countries, they have faced three challenges. First of all, satisfy their own energy need. Secondly, it should be green and low carbon. Fourthly, they would have to adjust to the changes and consequences of the CC, the climate change. So if we rely on the developing countries to follow exactly the same route as China or other developed countries, it is not attainable. Only by leveraging the cutting-edge technologies can we ensure a leapfrog development of the developing countries. So when I stay in China, I know that the obligation for a fixed line is of high cost. In African countries, they do not not even know what is a fixed line telephone, because when they are at a stage of using the communication, they are already at an age of mobile communication. So the same phenomenon is happening in the energy sector. The leveraging of the cutting edge technology, digital technology, and renewable energy would be able to cope with the three challenges I have mentioned. In countries in Asia and Africa, we are using the rooftop PV panels. These are mainly supplied by the private company, and they installed the installation of the rooftop PV panels. So the citizens do not need to install these things. They just need to pay the electricity bill. The digital technology utilized by the private suppliers is a wonderful solution to resolve the energy demand in a green way, and also a micro grid. It is integration of the power generation and the power storage to satisfy the power supply in a small community in a remote area. I believe all these technologies used would be empower the developing countries to have a leapfrog development. What they needed most is, first of all, capital, as we have mentioned frequently, and advanced technology indeed. And we also need to have a commercial viable model, business model. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sustainable. From this regard, China would also like to share its own experiences with other developing countries. During the transformation of the developing countries, we have more opportunities than challenges. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Zhai. And hopefully, indeed, we can see technology enabling the leapfrogging of developing countries from traditional energy directly into cleaner energy and cleaner technologies. I'm told that we have to end at 10:45 sharp. Right now, we still have some time. So let me zoom out and see if there are any questions from the audience. How about we take one question from the audience, and then we'll have a quick question and a quick answer. So if we could please zoom in onto the audience, see if anybody has a question. Is anybody raising their hand? I can't see that well from my vantage point, but does anybody in the audience have a question? 观众朋友们有没有问题？我们现在还有点时
So
间。
question from the audience. Do you have any questions from the audience?
Dr. Zhai, I mean, can you take a look behind you to see if anybody is raising their hand? And maybe just pass the microphone to that person. Great.
Good morning, moderator, and all the panelists. Mr. Zhou, we are very excited to hear the outcome of the COP26 and its analysis and the interpretation of the outcome of the COP26. I want to ask Mr. Zhou from ICBC. ICBC in November that PBOC have come out with the CO2 reduction financial tools. I really want to know what are the specific measures that you are going to leverage to support the net zero projects. I want to ask if the state-owned banks arrangements in this regard when you grant the credit facilities so that we can be more engaged in the net zero projects. Thank you so much, Mr. Zhou. Thank you so much for your question. for the green finance support, empowering low carbon transformation, CO2 reduction, carbon neutrality, and net zero. Since you are a businessman, for the funding support, I understand why you want to ask this question. I want to address it from the two following perspectives. Because of the time limit, I would like to simplify my answer in a very brief way. As you have mentioned that our financial tools to support the CO2 emission, it is a new policy from PBOC, our central bank. It can be implemented, the policy of which can be illustrated in the following ways.
First is leverages refinancing to support those initiatives. So for commercial banks, they could apply for refinancing funding support from PBOC, accounting for 60% of the loan. It extends to a green project. A second part is about cost. It is a relatively low-cost refinancing rate. But what specifically is the rate? You could check it up online. For example, 1.75%. And thirdly, this loan or refinancing package could be extended for another year. So that helps commercial banks better support low carbon development. That's a good source of support. But for commercial banks to support low carbon projects, they must be subject to relevant regulations saying that all those loans must be provided to genuine green projects while avoiding greenwash. It should be genuinely green instead of washed green. That's a very important part about this policy. It's having been promulgated by Central Bank of China, PBOC. Second, for commercial banks themselves, there's a lot we can do. First, for green credit, we have had a total of 4 trillion RMB yuan of a loan book as green credit by domestic commercial banks. And the growth rate of green credit is higher than overall credit, all categories, covering all categories. That's on the credit side. But talking about financing, it covers not only credit, but also bonds. There are three things that banks can do on green bonds. It can invest in green bonds. It can underwrite green bonds. And also it can serve as agents and brokers for green bonds as well. The green bond offering is another source of support for green projects. In addition, banks can work with non-bank financial institutions such as investment funds and insurers to go green. Starting from the beginning of this year, commercial banks in China have provided a host of tools and instruments to support green finance developments, so that green finance in China is growing rapidly. Going forward, according to our latest development strategy to go green, green credit and other types of green finances will continue to grow. Lastly, is about the carbon trading market. So carbon trading is not a core competency of banks. And banks are not yet a key player in the carbon market. But as I've mentioned, involving payment, settlement, clearing, delivery, and valuation, as well as portfolio carbon products or custody of carbon-based products. All those are possible areas for commercial banks to involve themselves in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Maybe
Okay.
offline, I can share with you more information.
Definitely. I mean, the opportunities for green finance absolutely limitless for China and indeed the world. Thank you for that, Dr. Zhou. We are completely out of time, so I just want to thank all of our online panelists who joined us, as well as Dr. Zhai, who's in person with us in Guangzhou, talking about this very urgent topic, this very big challenge that we face as humanity. We heard from Mr. Barroso in his opening remarks in terms of the spirit of cooperation, and we constantly hear about global stimulus, right? Unprecedented monetary and fiscal policies when it comes to tackling the pandemic. We certainly need an unprecedented boost in terms of international cooperation and multilateralism to really tackle this challenge that faces us all. So this conversation is certainly not over. It is just getting started, and hopefully we will continue to talk about this at each successive IFF event. So thank you all to our online panelists. Thank you and the audience for joining us bright and early Sunday morning. And thank you, of course, to Mr. Barroso as well as Mr. Takeuchi for delivering video remarks for us. Great. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again.